If somebody was going to do it, it would be me. That was Mohamed Salah after the penalty. Not before it, not in a dressing room speech. After he had walked up at Dallas Stadium in Arlington with Egypt's World Cup history on one side of the ball, Matt Ryan on the other, and decided that the safest thing to do was the least safe thing available, he chipped it. A Panenka in a knockout shootout with a hamstring that had made him look half a beat late all night. A Panenka after Australia had changed goalkeepers specifically for penalties. A Panenka in the match that finally gave Egypt its first World Cup knockout win. That is the funny thing about history. Sometimes it arrives as a roar. Sometimes it arrives floating slowly down the middle. Egypt beat Australia 4-2 on penalties after a 1-1 draw on July 3, 2026 in Arlington, Texas. Emam Ashour scored after 13 minutes. Mohamed Hany's own goal brought Australia level in the 55th. Harry Souttar sent Australia's first penalty over the bar. Lucas Harrington, 18 years old, hit the crossbar. Hossam Abdelmajid scored the decisive kick. That is the clean version. But this was not a clean night. It was a line of dominoes. One Australian lapse, one Egyptian own goal, one goalkeeper gamble. One superstar who had barely touched the match in the way superstars are supposed to touch it. One teenager on the spot, one captain in tears, and at the end of it, Egypt were not just alive. Egypt had crossed a line that had been sitting in front of them since 1934. The first domino came early, and it was almost too simple. Australia had settled into the game with the usual shape, physical, organized, hard to run through, not exactly writing poetry in possession. Egypt did not need poetry. Karim Hafez had space to deliver from the left. At the back post, Emam Ashour had space because Nestori Irankunda had not followed him. That was enough. Ashour headed in, and after 13 minutes, Egypt had the lead. There was no mystery to it, just a missed runner. In knockout football, that is often the whole murder weapon. For Australia, it was the worst kind of goal to concede because it did not feel inevitable. It felt careless, and this was already a match loaded with old disappointment. The Socceroos had never won a Men's World Cup knockout game. Italy stopped them in 2006. Argentina stopped them in 2022. Now, Egypt were standing in the same corridor, trying to open a door Australia had been pushing against for 20 years. Egypt had their own heavier version of that burden. They are not some minor football country surprised to be invited. Egypt are 7-time Africa Cup of Nations winners. They were the first African nation to appear at a World Cup back in 1934. And yet the tournament had never really belonged to them. Long absences, group stage exits, famous players, thin returns. Before this 2026 tournament, Egypt had never even won a match at the World Cup finals until the 3-1 victory over New Zealand in Vancouver. That is the awkward gap in Egypt's football identity. Continental giant, World Cup underachiever. A nation with medals at home and missing pages abroad. So when Ashour scored, the goal carried more than one scoreboard. Egypt were 1-0 up. Egypt were 77 minutes from a landmark. Egypt were also 77 minutes from discovering how uncomfortable a landmark can become when you can see it but not touch it. Then Mohamed Hany turned the match. 10 minutes after halftime, Aidan O'Neill's free kick came in. Hany was under pressure. Bodies were moving. The ball caught him wrong and his header went into his own net. Australia were level. Egypt had done the one thing Australia had struggled to do. For Hany, this was the wrong kind of history again. He had already scored an own goal earlier in the tournament against Belgium. This second one made him part of one of the strangest statistical stories of the World Cup. AP reported him as the first player to score 2 own goals in a single edition, while Opta's records put him as the second after Bulgaria's Ivan Vutsov in 1966. So the safest way to say it is this. Hany joined the smallest and most unwanted club in World Cup defending, and his own goal was also tied to a wider tournament record, with 2026 passing the previous high for own goals in one edition. Very prestigious. Nobody will be asking for the plaque. But the important thing is not just the record, it is what the own goal did to Egypt's mind. Before it, Egypt had a lead to protect. After it, they had a wound to carry. Salah was not fully himself. Omar Marmoush had missed a clear chance shortly after the restart. Australia had already lost Jordy Boss before halftime after a heavy collision. The match was becoming more physical, less clean, more anxious. Exactly the kind of game where the team with the bigger historical burden can start negotiating with ghosts. And let's be fair, this was not Egypt at their most convincing. The romance of the ending should not rewrite the 120 minutes. Egypt were shaky at the back. Australia were blunt in open play. The game had long stretches where tension did most of the entertainment work. Salah's touch came and went. His running was selective. His hamstring problem from the group stage was visible in the way he chose moments instead of dominating minutes. That matters because the final image is so powerful that it can make everything before it look inevitable. It was not inevitable. Egypt survived plenty of their own mess. But survival is not a footnote at a World Cup. It is a skill. And Hossam Hassan, of all people, knew what kind of night this had become. Hassan was one of Egypt's great forwards, a national legend who now had to coach a game that was sliding away from clean tactics and into pure nerve. Before the shootout, his message was not complicated. He told his players to block out the crowd, block out the goalkeeper, block out the noise, and think only about the kick. It sounds like a line from a coaching manual. It is also precisely what most humans cannot do when a stadium is staring at their feet. Australia had their own plan for that moment. Tony Popovic took off Patrick Beach and sent on Matt Ryan for the penalties. This is the move everyone loves when it works and everyone laughs at when it does not. Ryan is experienced. Ryan has captained Australia. Ryan has seen shootouts, pressure, reputations, the usual little theater around the penalty spot. Beach had just made a major save late in the game, tipping Rami Rabia's header over. But Popovic wanted the veteran for the specialist job. The specialist job then began with Harry Soutar blazing the first penalty over the bar. That is the problem with penalty plans. They often depend on the other team being polite enough to follow the script. Egypt scored. Australia scored, Egypt scored, Australia scored. Ryan had not changed the weather. Then Salah walked up. This is where the match stopped being merely dramatic and became personal. Salah is 34. He came into the game nursing a hamstring strain from Egypt's draw with Iran. He had not bent the match around himself. In open play, he had looked less like the man who has made elite defenders panic for years and more like a captain rationing his legs. There were loose moments. There was a shot over the bar in extra time on his weaker right foot. There were stretches where Egypt needed him to be central, and he was almost outside the game. That is the unfair standard around great players. If they are quiet for 115 minutes and perfect for one, we argue about which version was real. For Salah, the World Cup has always had that argument attached to it. His club career has been crowded with goals, records, finals, titles, and nights when the game seemed to move at his speed. With Egypt at the World Cup, there had never been a deep run to match the myth. In 2018, he arrived injured. In 2022, Egypt did not qualify. In 2026, here he was, older, not fully fit, and standing over the ball with a goalkeeper brought on to stop exactly this. Then he gave the match its signature, a chip down the middle. The Panenka is not just a penalty technique, it is an accusation. It says to the goalkeeper, "You will move first." It says to the crowd, "I can hear you, and I am still choosing calm." It says to your teammates, "If fear is in the room, let it start with me." But if it goes wrong, nobody calls it leadership. They call it vanity. They call it arrogance. They replay it for years. The line between genius and stupidity is about 3 inches of falling ball. Salah's fell perfectly. Afterwards, he explained it with a veteran's straight face. "If somebody was going to do it, it would be me," he said. "I am more experienced than others, and I wanted to give them confidence." He added that he decided at the last moment, and then the line that made the risk feel human. "I don't know if it's my last World Cup, so I had to do it." That sentence changes the penalty. It was not only a flex. It was an old superstar staring at the narrowing road and refusing to take the ordinary route through it. Maybe this is his last World Cup. Maybe it is not. But he knew Egypt had spent too many years waiting for one clean World Cup memory. So he made one. A chip down the middle. And because football has a cruel sense of balance, the next great image belonged to an Australian teenager. Lucas Harrington was 18, a defender. Australia's future, suddenly asked to answer for Australia's past. Soutar had already missed. Ryan had not saved one. Egypt had been flawless. Harrington hit the bar. There are misses that fly into the stands and disappear. This one came back off the frame, as if the goal itself had rejected the idea. His teammates moved toward him. Our Mobile, Jackson Irvine, Iran Kunda. The cameras stayed because cameras always stay. That is the part of football nobody really knows how to make decent, the public close-up of private collapse. Then Hassam Abdelmageed walked up for Egypt. Slow run, check. Ryan moved left. Abdelmageed sent the ball the other way. Egypt had scored all four. The shootout was over. And only then did the night release itself. Abdelmageed tore off his shirt and ran to the corner. Egyptian players sprinted after him. Hassam Hassan cried. Salah cried. This was not polished joy. It was relief escaping through every available door. That is why the imperfections actually matter. If Egypt had won 4-0 with Salah scoring a hat-trick, the story would be simpler and maybe smaller. Instead, they won like a team carrying all of its contradictions at once. A defender with 2 own goals in the tournament, a half-fit icon. A coach whose team had to endure as much as it created. A match that was often scrappy, sometimes ugly, and still historic. For Australia, the ending was the opposite kind of clarity. The Socceroos did not get humiliated. They got close. That is worse in some ways. They were in a knockout match they could absolutely have won. They had the goalkeeper change. They had the equalizer. They had a young team Popovic wants to push toward a higher level. And still the old line remains. No Men's World Cup knockout win. 3 attempts, 3 defeats. The Ryan decision will be argued because that is what failed gambles become. Popovic can defend the logic. Matt Ryan's experience is real. Beach is newer. Penalties are psychological. All of that is reasonable. None of it changes the screenshot. Ryan watching 4 Egyptian penalties go in, while the first and last Australian failures decide the night. That is the brutal accounting of knockout football. Good reasoning can still produce a bad result. A bold call can still look silly by midnight. A teenager can become the face of a national ache without doing anything except putting his foot through a ball. And now Egypt's prize is Argentina. Very thoughtful of the bracket. History first, Messi immediately after. Argentina reached the last 16 by surviving Cape Verde 3-2 after extra time in Miami. Messi scored again. Cape Verde came back twice. Christian Romero forced the decisive moment from a Messi corner, the ball going in off Dini Borges. The champions were pushed hard. They also survived, which is what champions tend to do right before everyone announces they are vulnerable. So Egypt do not get a gentle landing. They get Atlanta Tuesday, July 7th and a meeting with the holders. Salah against Messi is the poster. Egypt against the weight of the World Cup is the real match behind the poster. Because this win does not make Egypt perfect. It makes them dangerous in a different way. They know they can look ordinary and still pass the test. They know they can concede a crushing own goal and still reset. They know Salah does not need to own every minute to own the moment. And they know that for once, when Egypt reached the part of the World Cup that had always exposed them, they did not disappear. That is the wide shot. The 48-team World Cup has opened more doors, but the knockout rounds are still narrow enough to bruise everyone who tries to pass through. Australia found that out again. Cape Verde found it against Argentina. Egypt, after decades of underachievement on this stage, found the little strip of space between panic and history. And Salah put the ball there, a chip down the middle. So tell me, was that Panenka genius, madness, or the only penalty a player like Salah could take in that moment? Did Popovic's Ryan gamble make sense before it failed? And against Argentina, is Egypt walking into a wall? Or did Arlington just give them something more dangerous than form, belief? Leave your take in the comments. And if you want World Cup stories with the drama kept high and the facts kept honest, subscribe and stay close. This tournament is getting stranger by the round.